She buried her husband on a Tuesday. By Friday, her own son looked her in the eye and laughed. 64 years old, 41 years of marriage, and in the air, and all Frances Bowen walked away with was a broken-down farmhouse and the sound of her son's voice telling her she had never really mattered anyway. But Raymond Bowen was not a careless man. He was a patient one. And somewhere inside that crumbling farmhouse he had left his wife something far more dangerous than money. He had left her the truth. The morning they read Raymond's will, Frances wore the same black dress she had worn to his funeral 3 days before. She had not washed it. She told herself she had not had the time. But that was not the truth. The truth was she could not bring herself to put it in the machine because washing it meant the week was over, and the week being over meant accepting that Raymond was actually gone, that the man she had loved since she was 22, the man who hummed off-key in the kitchen every Sunday morning and burned the toast and never once apologized for it, was in the ground now, and he was not coming back. So she wore the unwashed dress, and she drove herself to the law offices of Quinn and Hale alone, because there was no one left to drive her. The building sat on a quiet downtown street, one of those old brick buildings that had survived 3 rounds of city renovation, simply by being too stubborn to fall down. Frances sat in her car for 11 minutes before she went inside. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the clock on her dashboard like it owed her something. She kept thinking about what Raymond had said to her in the hospital, 3 weeks before the end, when the morphine had started blurring the edges of things, and his voice had gone thin and papery. He had reached over and taken her hand and said 2 words, "Trust me." She had thought he meant he was not afraid. She had thought he meant everything would be all right. That was what dying men said, wasn't it? They tried to make it easier on the ones being left behind. But sitting in that car looking up at the law office, something cold moved through her. Trust me. What if he had meant something else entirely? She went inside. A young woman led her down a carpeted hallway to a conference room with a long mahogany table and windows that looked out onto nothing interesting. There was already someone in the room when she arrived. Garrett. Her son was 40 years old and looked nothing like his father, which had always quietly broken her heart. Raymond had been gentle in his features, soft eyes, a slow smile, the kind of face that made strangers feel like they already knew him. Garrett had inherited Frances's sharper jaw, her restless energy, but none of the warmth that usually came with it. He was handsome the way a knife is handsome. Clean lines, no softness. He was sitting at the head of the table, not the middle, not the side. The head, as though the meeting were already his. He did not stand when she came in. He glanced up from his phone, gave her a nod that managed to feel both dismissive and performative at once, then looked back down at the screen. "Mom," he said. Not how are you holding up. Just the word, the way you might acknowledge a piece of furniture that had managed to walk into the room. His wife, Sloane, sat to his right. Her blonde hair pulled back into something expensive and architectural. She gave Frances a smile tight, practiced the kind of smile that is really just a face, rearranging itself into the shape of politeness. "You look tired, Frances," she said. Frances sat down across from them, folded her hands on the table, and said nothing. Howard Quinn came in a few minutes later. He had been Raymond's attorney for 20 years, a compact, careful man in his late 50s, with silver-framed glasses, and the unhurried manner of someone who had sat through enough of these meetings to know that the worst part was never the paperwork. He offered his condolences first, and when he said Raymond had been a man of uncommon integrity, his voice dropped half a register, the way voices do when grief is personal. Garrett shifted in his chair. "We appreciate that, but maybe we should get started." Howard looked at him a moment over his glasses. Then he looked at Frances. "Of course," he said, and opened the folder. She does not remember every word of what came next. She has replayed it enough times that the edges have gone soft, the way a photograph does if you handle it too much. But the shape of it she remembers perfectly. Raymond's estate was considerable. 41 years of work of building something from almost nothing. Bowen Industries had started as a regional supply company and grown under Raymond's quiet and relentless attention into something worth far more than anyone outside the family fully understood. The company, its assets, its shares, its holdings, its operational control passed in full to Garrett Bowen. Frances heard Sloane exhale. She heard Garrett murmur something low and satisfied. She kept her eyes on Howard's face because Howard's face was still very careful. And careful faces usually mean there is more coming. There was more coming. To Frances Bowen, wife of 41 years, the woman who had held Raymond's hand while he learned to be a father, who had sat with him through 3 business failures before the 4th one finally held, who had folded herself smaller and smaller so his life could have more room. Raymond left the farmhouse. Just the farmhouse. The old property out on Route 9, 40 minutes outside the city. The one they had bought when Garrett was small and mostly stopped using once he left for college. The one with the drafty windows and the kitchen that flooded every spring, and the oak tree in the backyard that Raymond used to say was older than everyone's problems combined. The silence after Howard said it was very long. Garrett broke it. He laughed. Not a big laugh. Not a cruel cartoon of a laugh. Something quieter and almost worse. A short, controlled sound that said, "I knew it, and of course. And this is exactly right all at once." "Well," he said, sitting back in his chair, looking at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "At least you'll have somewhere to go." Sloane put a hand on his arm, not to stop him, to steady him the way you steady something expensive that you are afraid might tip over. "I'm just saying." He spread his hands open, reasonable, the gesture of a man who has decided his cruelty is actually logic. "I built a life. I have responsibilities. A business, employees, a family. And Mom..." He paused, tilted his head, chose his next words with the care of someone who wants the wound to be clean. "Mom dedicated herself to being a wife. That's a valid choice. But it's not the same as building something." Frances looked at her son. She had been in labor with him for 19 hours. She had taught him to read using flashcards spread out on the kitchen floor of their first apartment. She had driven him to practice every Saturday for 6 years. And when he quit to focus on debate, she had rearranged her whole schedule without a word. She had sat up 3 nights during his first year of college when he called her crying. And she had told no one, not Raymond, not Sylvia, not a single soul, because he had asked her not to. She had carried that secret like a stone in her chest for 22 years. And now he was explaining to her in a conference room with his wife, watching that what she had done with her life was not the same as building something. She did not cry. She wants that understood. She did not cry. She looked at her son and felt something in her go very quiet. Not empty. Not numb. Just still. The way water goes, still right before it freezes. "Are you finished?" she asked. He blinked. He had not expected that. He had expected tears, or protests, or the kind of wounded silence he could later dismiss as dramatic. "Garrett, are you finished?" He shut his mouth. She turned to Howard. "Is there anything else?" There was. Howard cleared his throat, a small, deliberate sound, and reached into his folder again. He produced a sealed envelope and slid it across the table toward her. "Raymond left specific instructions," he said. "There's a letter addressed to you personally, Francis. He asked that it not be opened here. He was very clear. He asked that you open it at the farmhouse, and not before." Garrett frowned. "Why?" He didn't explain why, Howard said in the pleasant tone of a man who absolutely knows why and has been professionally sworn to silence. He simply asked that Francis open it there. Sloane leaned forward. "What does it say?" "It's sealed," Francis said. She picked up the envelope and put it in her purse. "It's a letter, not a subpoena." Garrett stared at her purse. Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker she had not seen there in years. Not quite concern. Not quite curiosity. Something that looked briefly uncomfortably like fear. "Dad always had to make things complicated," he said. But his voice had changed slightly. The confidence had gone just softer at the edges. Francis stood, gathered her coat, and extended her hand to Howard Quinn. "Thank you," she said. "Raymond was lucky to have you." Howard held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "He spoke about you often, Francis. He was very proud of you." She nodded. She did not look at Garrett. She walked out. She sat in her car a long time before she started the engine. The envelope was in her purse, and she could feel the weight of it, which was ridiculous, because it weighed almost nothing. It was paper and ink and a dead man's handwriting, but it pressed against her hip like something much heavier. On the drive home, she went through the stages of it the way you do when something terrible has been confirmed after a long time of suspecting. First, the numbness, the useful blankness that keeps you functional when you most need to be. She stopped at a red light and watched a woman walk a dog, and thought that's a nice dog, and felt nothing. Then the grief. Not new grief, not for Raymond that was always there, now layered underneath everything. Old grief. For the version of Garrett she had believed in longer than the evidence supported. There is a particular heartbreak that belongs only to parents the moment you finally stop making excuses and see your child clearly, and what you see is disappointing and frightening in yours. And then, underneath the grief, something quieter. He left you the farmhouse, Francis. He left you the farmhouse and a letter and told you to go there. Raymond was not a careless man. He was not sentimental without purpose. The farmhouse was not just a property. It was the place where they had been most themselves before money complicated things, before Garrett grew up and got sharp. Raymond had talked about restoring it every year for the last decade, in the specific way people talk about things they are actually planning to do. Trust me. She merged onto the highway and made a decision. She would go, tonight. She stopped at her apartment first, changed out of the black dress, finally washed it, and put on something comfortable. Jeans and a sweater that had been Raymond's soft gray, with a small moth hole near the left cuff. She had never mended because she could not bring herself to. She called Sylvia, who lives in Portland, and had not been able to come for the funeral because of her hip. She told her about the will. Not the letter, just the will. Sylvia was quiet a moment. Then in her very Sylvia way, she said, "That boy of yours has always been a selfish little thing, and I'm only saying what you're thinking." Francis did not answer. Sylvia took that as confirmation. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to the farmhouse. Tonight." "By yourself, Francis. It's been empty 8 years. Is the heat even on?" "Raymond left me a letter. He asked me to open it there." A silence on the line. Sylvia had known Raymond almost as well as Francis did. She understood what it meant that he had asked for something specific. "Okay," she said more quietly. "You call me when you get there." "I will." "And Francis, whatever's in that letter, it's from him, not from whatever today was. Today was Garrett. The letter is Raymond." Francis held the phone to her ear a moment after her sister finished. "I know," she said. "I know." The drive to Route 9 takes 40 minutes in good traffic. It was nearly 7 in the evening by the time she got there, and the last of the light had turned that specific winter orange that always made her feel like the sky was apologizing for something. The farmhouse sat back from the road down a long gravel driveway lined with old maples that had lost their leaves weeks ago. Their bare branches stood against the orange sky, and for a moment pulling in she had the strange feeling of driving back in time, of being 30 years old again, a boy asleep in the back seat with his cheek against the window. Raymond at the wheel humming something tuneless and pleased. The house was dark. Of course it was dark. It had been dark for 8 years, kept barely alive by a caretaker. Raymond paid to hold the worst of the neglect at bay. The porch sagged in one corner. Paint peeled from the window frames. The garden she had once tended every September was overgrown and shapeless, years of neglect, having turned it from something cultivated into something feral. But the bones were good. Raymond always said that. "The bones are good, Franny. Good bones outlast everything." She got out of the car. The air was cold and smelled of frozen earth and dry leaves. The key she had, the one that had hung unused on a hook in her apartment for years, still worked, though the lock was stiff and protested. The door swung inward with the particular creak of a house that has been waiting. A lamp came on in the hallway. The electricity was still connected, at least. The light was warm and unsteady, an old bulb, and it lit up a hallway thick with dust and memory. Raymond's boots were still by the door. Old brown work boots, the ones he wore every time they came out here. He had left them there a decade ago and nobody had moved them. They sat on the mat exactly where he had left them, cracked and dried and completely themselves. Francis stood there a long time just looking at those boots. Then she sat down on the hallway floor in her good jeans and Raymond's gray sweater. And she did something she had not done since the hospital. She cried. She does not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the floor to be cold through her jeans. Long enough for the worst of it to pass, which it does. Grief always does. It never goes away, but it passes through like a weather system. And afterward, the air is different. She stood up. dusted off her knees, went to the kitchen, ran the tap, until the water came clear, splashed some on her face. Okay, she told herself. Okay. She took the envelope from her purse, Raymond's handwriting on the front. Francis, in the slightly formal, slightly cramped way he always wrote her name. He had always said he wrote her name carefully, because it deserved to be written carefully. The kind of thing she used to dismiss as sentimental, and now understood had been keeping her afloat her entire adult life. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Garrett had eaten cereal on Saturday mornings, where she and Raymond had argued once badly, the only time they ever really argued about money, and then made up quietly without drama, the way two people committed to each other learn to do. She opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter and taped to the inside flap a key. Small. Gold-colored. Old by the look of it. She set the key on the table and unfolded the letter. 3 pages. My Francis, if you're reading this, then the day has come that I've been preparing for longer than you know. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I had to keep so much from you, but I need you to read every word before you do anything else. Promise me that. I've spent the last months watching our son. I know you've done the same with that particular patience you have that I never fully deserved. You see Garrett more clearly than I do, because you love him in a more complicated way. I loved him the way fathers love sons, which has a certain blindness built into it. You loved him the way mothers love sons, which is eyes open even when you'd give anything to close them. The company is not what Garrett thinks it is. What he inherited today is a shell. A very convincing shell, documented correctly, announced properly, but a shell. Over the last 14 months, I have worked quietly with Howard Quinn to restructure Bowen Industries. The real assets, the investments, the property, the cash, the trusts have all been moved. Legally. Carefully. Completely. What remains is a company that looks healthy and is not. The debts are real. The contracts Garrett will discover are real in their terms and catastrophic in their obligations. I said nothing because I needed him to walk into this believing it was real. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I did this out of anger. I didn't. I did it because I love him. I watched our son become someone I didn't recognize, someone who believed that wealth was a virtue. Someone who treated people with less as if less was what they deserved. I watched how he spoke to you when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I heard things I was never meant to hear, and I made a decision. A man who has always had everything will never understand the value of anything. He needs to lose it. He needs to lose it completely, without cushion, and rebuild from nothing, because that is the only thing that will save him from the person he's becoming. Now, the gold key. Go to the study. The small room off the back hallway, the one I always kept locked, the one you asked about twice, and I told you was just storage. I'm sorry I lied about that. There's a panel in the east wall 3 feet from the window behind the bookcase. Push the lower left corner. What you find belongs to you. All of it. Every document has your name on it. Howard has copies. It is entirely legal, entirely yours, and has been for 6 months. I didn't tell you sooner because I needed your reaction today to be real. The number is larger than you're expecting. Don't panic. And Francis, don't be too hard on Garrett over this. What I'm doing to him isn't cruelty. It's the most serious love I know how to give. It's the only kind that might actually work on the man he's become. You were never the lesser inheritance. You were never the consolation prize. You were always the point. I have loved you since I was 24, and you walked into my parents' kitchen in a green coat, arguing with someone on the telephone, not even noticing me standing there. And I thought, well, there she is. There she is. Trust me, Raymond. She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat very still at the kitchen table with dust on every surface, and Raymond's boots by the door, and a small gold key in front of her, and her heart was beating very fast. The study was down the back hallway, past the bathroom with the cracked tile, past the linen closet that always stuck. She had walked past it 10,000 times. She had asked about it twice and accepted his answers and moved on, because that was the kind of trust they had built, the kind where you do not require an explanation for every locked door. She picked up the key. She stood. She walked down the back hallway, and every step felt strange, not unreal, but hyper-real, the way certain moments are when you understand the ground is about to shift, and you are walking toward it anyway. The gold key opened the study door. Inside was a small room that smelled of old paper and cedar, lined with shelves and filing cabinets, a single window, a lamp on a wooden desk. And in the east wall, exactly where Raymond had said a bookcase. She moved it. It was lighter than expected, built to move, designed to move. There was the panel. She pressed the lower left corner. It opened. Behind it was a safe built into the wall, heavy and old and real. The same key opened it. She is going to try to describe what she saw, but description does not fully cover it. Numbers do not fully cover it. What she felt standing there was not just shock. It was something more complicated. Grief and love, and the particular vertigo of realizing that the man she loved had been in his quiet and methodical way, thinking about her and protecting her, and building something for her, even while he was dying, even while she sat beside him in the hospital and held his hand and thought she was the one holding him up. He was holding her up. He had always been holding her up. The safe held a bound portfolio of investment accounts with her name as sole beneficiary, property deeds for 7 parcels, including the farmhouse, including 2 commercial properties in the city, including land in the valley she had not known he owned. A sealed legal packet with a letter from Howard Quinn confirming everything had been transferred to Francis Bowen 6 months prior. Fully notarized, fully recorded. Cash, a moderate amount, enough to be useful, not enough to be frightening. And at the bottom, a smaller envelope on which Raymond had written simply the number. Inside that envelope was a single piece of paper. The number on it had 9 digits, 93,240,000. She put the paper down on the desk. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard, at the bare maples, at the sky that had gone fully dark now and was thick with stars. "Don't panic," he had written. She almost laughed. The sound that came out of her was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but somewhere in between that particular human sound that has no proper name. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass "You impossible man," she whispered. The stars did not answer. The house held its breath. Somewhere an owl called once and went quiet. She stood there a long time, Raymond's sweater around her shoulders, and she let everything in. The grief and the love and the shock and the strange, terrifying, expanding feeling of being for the first time in a very long time. The person at the center of the story instead of the person at the edges. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the old kitchen with the papers and a cup of tea. She actually drank this time, and she read everything twice, and she called Sylvia at midnight, even knowing she would be asleep. "Francis, it's midnight. Raymond left me $93 million in a safe behind a bookcase in the farmhouse." A very long silence. "Say that again," Sylvia said. She said it again. Another silence. "I'm gonna need you to say that one more time because I'm old and my hearing isn't what it was. 93 million and some change." And some change. Francis started laughing. Genuinely laughing, the kind that comes when everything has been too much for too long. And something finally cracks it open. And Sylvia started laughing too. And they laughed until they were both crying a little, and then they just breathed at each other across the phone line. Two old women. Two sisters. 3 in the morning in different time zones holding on. "He loved you," Sylvia said finally. "He loved you so much." "I know," Francis said. She looked at Raymond's boots by the door. "I know." Before she slept in the main bedroom with the window that looked out over the oak tree, she read the last lines one more time. "You were always the point." "Okay, Raymond," she said, to the room, to the house, to whatever remained of a man and the things he had touched and loved and left carefully behind. "Okay, I trust you, but it's mine now. What happens next is mine." She turned off the light. Outside, the oak tree stood in the dark, patient and enormous, its bare branches completely still. In the days that followed, Garrett Bowen began to celebrate his inheritance. He did not yet know what he had actually inherited. He would find out soon. And when he did, Francis had already decided she would not be a spectator to it. She would be the one holding the rope. She spent 3 days at the farmhouse before she went back to the city. 3 days of going through Raymond's papers, of calling Howard Quinn with questions, of walking through every room with a notepad, trying to understand the full scope of what her husband had built in secret, while the rest of them weren't looking. Howard was patient with her and plain in a way he clearly had been waiting to be. "He started 14 months ago," he told her on the second morning, his voice steady and professional over the phone. "When the diagnosis came back serious. He didn't tell you because I would have argued with him," Francis said. A pause. "Yes, that was his concern. He was right. I would have argued with him. He knew that too." She sat on the old porch steps with the notepad on her knees and looked out at the overgrown garden. Frost had settled overnight on the dead grass, and in the morning light, it looked almost intentional, like someone had tried to make something beautiful out of the end of things. Howard. When Garrett figures out what the company actually is, how long before it becomes visible? He was quiet a moment, the careful kind of quiet. "Raymond estimated 6 to 8 weeks before the first obligations come due. That can be met. After that," he paused. "It moves quickly. 6 to 8 weeks. She wrote it on the notepad and circled it. "He's going to be devastated." Yes, and angry, almost certainly. At Raymond, at me. Francis. Howard's voice gentled. Raymond was very clear on one thing. He said, and I'm reading from his notes, Francis is not to feel guilty about this. She didn't do it. I did. If Garrett needs someone to be angry at, he can be angry at me. I can take it. She pressed her lips together. That was Raymond. So completely Raymond that it almost knocked the air out of her. Even from beyond whatever came after, he was still trying to take the weight off her shoulders. But here's the thing. Howard did not understand, and the thing Raymond, for all his planning, could not have controlled. Francis did not intend to hide behind the weight Raymond had agreed to carry. The plan was his, but the living of it was hers. She would decide what to do with what he had left her. She would decide who to confront and who to let fall, and when to step in and when to stand back. The man had built her a fortress. What she did inside it was her business. By the third day, she had a clear picture, and it was larger and more deliberate than the letter had prepared her for. The $93 million was not one lump sum sitting in one account. It was structured, diversified, layered across investments and property and trusts in a way that made it almost impossible to attack legally and very easy to live from quietly. Raymond had thought of everything. Tax, liquid access, long-term management. He had spent 14 months of his dying building her a fortress, and he had done it while sitting across from her at dinner, asking how her day was, never once letting it show on his face. She did not know whether to be grateful or furious or devastated. She settled eventually on all three at once. The call from Garrett came 9 days later. She was in her apartment kitchen making soup, actual soup from scratch, the kind Raymond used to request in winter when her phone buzzed on the counter and his name appeared on the screen. She looked at it. 3 rings, 4. She picked up. "Mom." His voice was different. Not the conference room voice, controlled and deliberate. This was something raw, though he was working to keep it contained. "I need to ask you something." "Hello, Garrett." "Did you know," just like that, no preamble, "about the company? Did you know what Dad did?" She set the wooden spoon against the side of the pot. "What makes you think your father did something?" "Because I've been going through the financial records for a week." And now she could hear it. The strain underneath the controlled voice. A thread pulled too tight. "And what I'm finding doesn't make sense. There are debt obligations I didn't know existed. There are contracts with terms that are... I had 3 lawyers look at them and they all said the same thing. These are designed to fail. These contracts were designed to fail." His voice cracked just slightly. He caught it. "Mom, did you know?" Francis looked at her soup, the steam rising slow and steady. Here was the first choice she got to make on her own. She could comfort him. She could deny. She could soften it the way she had softened everything for 40 years. She did none of those things. "You should talk to Howard Quinn," she said. Silence on the line. "He was your father's attorney for 20 years. If there are questions about the structure of the company, Howard is the right person." "Mom." Something sharper now. Something at the border of accusation. "Do you know what's in that company? Do you know what I actually inherited?" "Call Howard Garrett," she said. And then, because she meant it and because she was done bending, "I mean it," she hung up. Her hands were not completely steady when she set the phone back on the counter, but they were steadier than she would have expected. She picked up the spoon and stirred the soup and breathed through it, and thought about Raymond 14 months out from his diagnosis, sitting in a room with his attorney, quietly building a trap for his son that was also somehow the most extravagant act of love she had ever witnessed. The soup was good. She ate it alone at the kitchen table, looking out at the winter street, and she thought, this is what the next part of my life feels like. Alone, quiet, eating soup I made myself in an apartment with my name on the lease, watching a city go by, knowing for the first time in a long time that I am not dependent on anyone's mercy. It was not joy. Not yet. But it was something important. It was safety. And underneath the safety, something newer still. The faint, unfamiliar pleasure of being the one in charge. 2 weeks after that call, Sloan showed up at her door. It was a Tuesday morning. Frances was in the middle of a phone call with a property manager Howard had recommended. She heard the knock, thought it was the building's maintenance man, and opened the door in her housecoat and reading glasses. Sloan stood in the hallway in a camel coat that had not been cheap. Her hair done perfectly, holding 2 cups of coffee from the good place 3 blocks away. She looked composed the way a person looks composed when they have been practicing composure since early morning. "I should have called," she said. "Yes. I brought coffee. I can see that. Can I come in?" Frances was not sure she wanted her to. She and Sloan had never been close. Sloan had married Garrett when he was 32, and she was 29. And she had always treated Frances with the particular brand of politeness that is really a form of distance. Careful, consistent, impossible to argue with. She was not cruel the way Garrett could be cruel. She was just absent. And Frances had never been sure whether she was absent because she did not care, or because she had learned it from Garrett the way you learn everything from the person you live with. But she had brought the good coffee, and she had come alone. Frances stepped back and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, and Sloan wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at Frances in a way she never had before. Direct, without the performance. "He's falling apart," she said. Frances said nothing. "The lawyers found another set of obligations last week. The investors there were 3 calls yesterday. He was on the phone until midnight, and when he came to bed, he just..." She stopped. Something moved across her face. He didn't sleep. He lay there staring at the ceiling. I've never seen him like this in 12 years. She looked up. "Did you know about the company?" "Your father-in-law," Frances said carefully, "was a very deliberate man." "So you did know." "I found out after he died." Sloan nodded slowly, processing. "Was it punishment for Garrett?" Frances thought about the letter. "This is not punishment. This is the most serious love I know how to give." "No," she said. "It wasn't punishment. It feels like punishment. I know it does." Frances turned her cup in her hands. "Sloan, can I ask you something honest?" "Okay. Did you think what Garrett said to me in that conference room was acceptable?" The question landed flat between them. Sloan did not flinch from it, which surprised Frances. She held still, and the thing moved across her face again. Not guilt exactly, recognition. "No," she said. "I didn't." "Did you say so?" A pause. "No." "Why not?" Sloan looked down at the table, and for a moment she was quiet. And Frances let her be quiet because she had learned over 64 years. that the silence people fill with honesty is worth waiting for. Finally, Sloane said, "Because I chose him. And when you choose someone, you convince yourself the parts of them you don't like are smaller than they are, or that they'll change." She stopped, started again. "I kept thinking it would pass. His attitude toward you. I thought it was a phase. Stress. Grief about Raymond being sick. I kept thinking it would pass." "How long have you been thinking that?" She did not answer, but her face answered for her. "A long time." Frances reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Sloane's. Sloane looked startled, genuinely startled, like she had not expected the gesture and did not know what to do with it. "Go home," Frances said. "Take care of yourself. What happens with the company is going to happen, and it isn't something you or I can prevent. But you need to think very clearly about what you want your life to look like. Not Garrett's life. Yours." Sloane looked at her a moment, something in her face Frances could not quite read. Then she nodded, stood, buttoned her coat. "He's not all bad," she said at the door. Half statement, half question. "I know he's not. He's my son. I know every version of him, including the versions he doesn't know himself." Frances paused. "That's not the same as saying what he is right now is okay." Sloane left. Frances closed the door, poured her cold coffee down the sink, and called Howard Quinn. "It's starting," she told him. "Yes. The first default notice goes out Friday." She thought about Garrett somewhere in the city, watching everything he thought he had built begin to crack at the foundations. She was not afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. But fear, she was learning, was not the same as helplessness. She could be afraid and still be the one deciding how this went. What happened to Garrett over the next 6 weeks was not quiet. Frances watched it the way you watch a fire from across the street. Close enough to see clearly. Far enough that the heat does not reach you, or so you tell yourself. The first public signs came in the business press. Small items, the kind most people skim past. Questions about Bowen Industries' debt structure. A postponed contract announcement. An investor who had quietly withdrawn from a meeting without explanation. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they meant everything to anyone who knew how to read them. Garrett knew how to read them. He had spent his career knowing how to read them. And so he watched his own collapse announced in the language he had built his identity around. There was a cruelty in that. Not Raymond's intended cruelty. The accidental cruelty of the universe, which occasionally has a sense of irony. And then, the thing Raymond had not planned for arrived. The thing that turned Frances from a woman watching a fire into a woman standing in the path of it. His name was Walter Prescott. He was one of the larger investors in Bowen Industries. A man in his 60s with the kind of money that had been money for 3 generations, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having lost. He had not gotten where he was by accepting losses quietly. And somewhere, in the wreckage of the failing company, his people had started asking the right questions. Where had the assets gone? When? To whom? He found Frances on a Thursday. She was at the farmhouse when he came. She had driven out to meet the contractor about the heating system, and she was standing in the front garden in her boots and Raymond's gray sweater when a black car she did not recognize came up the gravel drive. A tall man got out. Silver hair, good coat, the unhurried walk of someone who is used to people waiting for him. Mrs. Bowen. He said it like he already knew the answer. Walter Prescott. I was an investor in your husband's company. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. Frances did not invite him inside. She stood her ground in the garden, the frost-killed grass crunching under her boots. And she looked at him the way she had looked at Garrett across the conference table. You may have a few minutes, she said, out here. He smiled the smile of a man recalculating. Of course. He looked around at the farmhouse, the sagging porch, the bare maples, taking inventory, the way men like him take inventory of everything. I'll be direct, Mrs. Bowen. Bowen Industries is going to fail. You know that, I think. What you may not know is that in the months before your husband's death, a substantial portion of the company's assets were transferred out. Property, investments, cash. My attorneys tell me those transfers may have been made specifically to remove value from the company before it collapsed, to shield it. He paused, let it land. From people like me, I see. Now. He spread his hands reasonable, and the gesture was so much like Garrett's that something in her went cold and still. I have no wish to drag a grieving widow through a lawsuit. That's unpleasant for everyone. But if those transfers were fraudulent, if they were designed to defraud the company's creditors, then they can be reversed. By a court. And anyone who received those assets could find themselves party to a very long, very expensive, very public legal proceeding. He looked at her almost gently. I imagine that's not how you'd like to spend your retirement. Frances was 64 years old. She had buried a husband 11 days into the worst month of her life. She had sat in a conference room and listened to her son tell her she had never built anything. And now a man with 3 generations of money was standing in her dead husband's garden, in the cold threatening her. She did not feel afraid. She noticed that the absence of fear, the way you notice a sound that has stopped. What she felt instead was something she had not felt in years. It rose up in her slow and clean, and it was almost like joy. Mr. Prescott, she said, you've done your homework, so let me save you some time. The transfers you're describing were completed and notarized 6 months before my husband died. They were reviewed by counsel. Every parcel, every account, every trust. They are legal. They are recorded. And they are mine. She took a step toward him. You're welcome to file. You'll spend 2 years and a great deal of money. And at the end of it, a judge will tell you what I'm telling you now for free. There is nothing to reverse, because nothing was hidden. My husband did not defraud his creditors. He restructured his estate. Men do it every day. The only difference is that he did it well. Prescott's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. The recalculating again faster now. You came out here, Frances went on, because you thought you'd find a frightened old woman who didn't understand what she'd inherited. Someone who'd settle quietly to make you go away. She let that sit. I understand exactly what I inherited, Mr. Prescott, and I am not in the habit of being frightened in my own garden. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the bare maples. Somewhere behind the house, the contractor's truck door slammed. Prescott smiled again, and this time it was a different smile. Smaller. Almost respectful. Your husband, he said, was a careful man. He was. But I'm the one standing here. She gestured at his car. It's a long drive back. You should go before the light's gone. He went. The black car backed down the gravel drive, turned and disappeared toward Route 9. Frances stood in the garden until she could no longer hear the engine. Then her knees went slightly weak, and she put a hand on the porch rail. And she laughed once short and surprised into the cold air. She had not known she had that in her. She had been a wife and a mother for 41 years, and she had folded herself small for most of it. And she had not known until a stranger threatened her in her own garden that there was something underneath all that folding that would not bend. She called Howard that evening and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. You should have called me first. I could have handled Prescott. I know you could have. I didn't want you to. She looked out the farmhouse window at the dark yard. Howard. For 40 years, men handled things for me. My husband handled the money. My son handled the contempt. I think I've reached the age where I'd like to handle a few things myself. A pause on the line. Then warm Raymond would have enjoyed watching that. Raymond would have driven out here and tried to do it for me. And I would have let him. She smiled at the empty kitchen. Which is rather the whole problem, isn't it? Sloane called twice over the following weeks, not to ask for anything, just to talk, which surprised Frances both times. The second time, she told her that Garrett had begun having panic attacks at night, which he refused to call panic attacks, and instead described as chest tightness from stress, which is what men of Garrett's generation call panic attacks when they cannot bring themselves to name the real thing. He won't see anyone, Sloane said. A doctor, a therapist, anyone. He says he's fine. He's not fine. I know. A pause. He asked me last night if I thought his father hated him. Frances closed her eyes. What did you say? I said no. I said Raymond didn't hate him. Another pause. But Frances, do you think he did? Even a little, do you think Raymond did all of this because somewhere underneath everything? No, Frances said. Firm. No hesitation. This one she was certain of. Raymond didn't hate him. He was frightened of who Garrett was becoming. Those are different things. Hatred wants the other person to suffer. What Raymond wanted was for Garrett to change. But the result looks the same right now. The result looks the same right now, Frances agreed. That's the hardest part. The lawsuit filings made the news 3 days later. Not one lawsuit. 4 filed within 48 hours of each other, by investors who had clearly been coordinating. Prescott's name was not among them, which told Frances he had taken her at her word. She read about it the same way she had been reading everything, with a kind of numb focus. What she had not anticipated was the photograph. One of the outlets had a photographer outside the Bowen Industries building that afternoon there, for an unrelated story. And the man had caught Garrett walking out at 3 in the afternoon alone, which was unusual. Mid-step on the sidewalk, not posed, just caught. He looked exhausted. He looked smaller than she remembered him looking. His suit was good, the way his suits were always good, but it hung slightly wrong, the way clothes hang on a body that has lost weight. It was not trying to lose. His jaw was set in the way that meant he was holding something together through sheer determination. He looked, she realized, with a shock that went all the way through her, like Raymond. Not in his features. Garrett still had her jaw, her restlessness. but in the expression, in the set of it. Raymond had looked exactly like that in the last months of his illness, when he was trying to protect her from how frightened he was. That particular brand of dignity that comes not from confidence, but from refusing to let the fear win. My son, she thought, has more of his father in him than either of them knew. She saved the photograph to her phone. She is not sure why. She still has it. It was a Thursday evening 5.5 weeks after the will reading when everything broke open in a way she had not expected. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from Sloan. 3 words. He just left. Francis called her. Sloan picked up on the first ring, and Francis could hear immediately that she had been crying. Not currently, recently. The kind of voice that has been wrung out and left to dry. He packed a bag, Sloan said. Not everything, a bag. He said he needed to think. He said he couldn't be in the house right now, because everything in it reminded him of what he'd failed at. She stopped, gathered herself. Francis, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. You're not supposed to do anything, Francis said firmly. You're supposed to let him go somewhere and be responsible for himself for a night. And you're supposed to take care of yourself. What if he'll be all right. She said it with the particular conviction of a woman who has been a mother for 40 years and understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do is sound certain even when you are not, because the person on the other end needs the steadiness more than they need the truth. After she hung up, Frances sat very still in her armchair a long time. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She got up, put on her coat, and drove across the city to the small park near the apartment building where Garrett had lived in his 20s before the big house. The park with the bench where he used to go when things got bad in those years. She cannot fully explain why she was certain he would be there. Mothers know certain things without being able to explain the mechanism of knowing. 20 minutes later, her headlights turned into the small lot beside the park, and a car she did not recognize. Something modest, a rental, maybe, pulled in. Garrett got out carrying a bag. He stood in the lot a moment, looking at the park, and even from across the street in the dark with distance between them, she could see that the thing holding him upright was barely doing its job. He walked into the park and sat on the bench, and here was the hardest decision of all. Not the confrontation with Prescott, not the will reading. This. She sat in her car and watched her son sit alone in a park in the dark in November, and every instinct she had built over 40 years told her to cross the street, to sit down beside him, to tell him it would be all right to take the weight off his shoulders the way she had always taken the weight off his shoulders, the way she had taken it off so many times that she had taught him without meaning to. That someone would always be there to take it. She did not cross the street. It was the most difficult thing she had ever made herself do. And she did it not because Raymond had asked her to. Raymond was dead. He had set the trap, but he was not the one sitting in this car making this choice. She was. She chose with her own will and her own grief to let her son sit at the bottom of the thing he had to reach the bottom of, because she had finally understood what Raymond had understood, that you cannot reach in and extract the lesson from a person before they have lived it all the way through. The only thing you can do is stay close enough that when they surface, you are there. She stayed an hour. Then she drove home. And that night she slept better than she had in weeks. and she is not entirely sure what that says about her. Maybe only that she had finally stopped waiting for Raymond's plan to work and started trusting her own judgment about when to stand back. The collapse, when it became fully public, was not graceful. There is a version of this story where Garrett's fall reads like something cinematic, clean lines, dramatic headlines, a man undone in a single decisive moment. That is not what happened. What happened was messier and slower, the way real things usually are when they fall apart. Not a single crash. A long, grinding unraveling each day, pulling another thread until the whole shape of it came loose. Sloane called on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the headlines started, her voice with none of the careful composure of their kitchen meeting. He came back after that night. He's been home, but he's not the same. He doesn't go into the office anymore. He sits in the study for hours. And then he comes out, and he's just blank, like someone turned something off behind his eyes. A pause. "I've started divorce proceedings, Francis. I wanted you to hear it from me." Francis was quiet a moment. "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet. I'm trying to figure out what fine looks like from here." A breath. "You told me to think about what I wanted my life to look like. I'm doing that. It's the first time in 12 years I've thought about it at all." "Then it isn't a failure," Francis said. "It's a beginning." They looked the same from the inside. After they hung up, Francis stood at her window a long time, looking out at the city. The first snow of the season had started, small flakes, tentative, the kind that are not sure yet whether they are committing. She thought about Garrett in his blank silence, about Sloane figuring out what fine looked like, about the long winter coming. And she thought with a calm that surprised her, it is almost time. He is almost at the bottom. And when he gets there, I will be the one who decides what comes next. He came to her apartment on a Thursday night, 7 weeks after the will reading. She heard the knock at 9 and knew before she opened the door. The knowing came from the same place the Park knowledge had come from, that particular maternal frequency that does not require explanation. She opened the door. Garrett stood in the hallway looking like a man who had driven across the city 3 times, trying to talk himself out of this and finally given up. His coat was damp. It had started raining an hour before, and he had not bothered with an umbrella. He was holding nothing. No bag, no briefcase. Just himself, which was clearly all he could manage. He looked at her. She looked at him. He opened his mouth and closed it again. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in. He stood in her hallway in his wet coat and looked around at her apartment with the unfocused look of someone whose brain is running too many processes to land on any of them. She went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, came back with a towel for his hair, which he accepted without comment. "Sit down," she said. He sat on her couch, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and stared at the floor. For a long moment he said nothing, and she let him say nothing because she had sat with enough grief and enough shame to know that some things take a minute to find the door out. "I had 4 lawyers on a call today," he said finally to the floor. "And at the end of it, the one I've used for 11 years. The one I trusted said his firm was withdrawing. He said he didn't think there was a viable path forward." His voice stalled. Those words, a viable path forward. He said it like he was reading from a script. She said nothing. "The company is gone, or it will be within 60 days. The assets that are left won't cover the obligations, and the investors know it now. There's nothing. He lifted his eyes from the floor and looked at her. Dad built something for 30 years and His voice broke at the edges and he caught it. I walked into it and thought it was mine. I thought I deserved it. Because I'd worked hard. Because I was better at it than you. He said it flat. No performance. Just the thing itself out in the air between them. That's what I thought. That Dad leaving you the farmhouse was him acknowledging I was the one who'd actually... He stopped, put his hands over his face. Mom, I said those things to you. In front of Howard. In front of Sloan. I said them to your face. And I meant them. I know, she said. How are you not? He looked at her. His eyes red, not quite crying, but close in the specific way men taught not to cry are close. How are you not furious with me? Frances looked at her son. 40 years old, wet from the rain, sitting in her apartment at 9 at night, with nowhere left to go, and nothing left to hide behind. She thought about the boy on the kitchen floor with the flashcards. She thought about Raymond's letter. He needs to rebuild from nothing because that is the only thing that will save him. And she thought about all the years in between. The years she had told herself it was a phase it would pass. He would come back. He had come back. Not the way she had imagined. Stripped down, hollowed out, sitting in a wet coat on her couch. But back. Present. Without the armor. I'm your mother, she said. I don't stop being your mother because you were cruel to me. But Garrett. She leaned forward slightly. I need you to understand something. What I feel right now, watching you sit there, it isn't triumph. I don't feel good about this. I don't feel vindicated. I feel the same thing I've always felt. I feel like I'm watching my son and hoping he's gonna be okay. I've felt that since you were 7 years old, and it doesn't go away. She held his gaze. That's not the same as saying it was okay. It wasn't. What you said to me, the way you've looked at me, dismissed me for years, that was not okay. And I'm not going to pretend it was. Something shifted in his face. She thinks he had been expecting her to soften it, the way he had maybe expected she would soften it his whole life. The way he had learned that the edge would always move if he pushed. It did not move this time. You're right, he said quietly. No argument. You're right. The kettle had boiled. She made 2 cups of plain tea and brought them back and sat in the chair across from him. And they sat like that a while, mother and son in a small apartment drinking tea in the rain. The silence was not comfortable, but it was real. And real was something they had not been in a long time. He stayed that night on her couch. She did not offer. He did not ask. It just happened the way certain things happen between people too tired to negotiate. In the morning, he was already up when she came out standing at the window with a cup of coffee. He had folded the blanket not perfectly, but he had tried, which was something. I made coffee, he said. I hope that's okay. It's fine. She poured a cup. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen. 2 people who had caused each other real harm, trying to figure out what came after that. And then Frances made the decision she had been turning over for weeks. Not Raymond's decision. Not Howard's. Hers. She decided it was time to tell him the truth. And she decided she would be the one to tell it in her own words, in her own time. "Sit down," she said. "There's something you need to know." He sat at the kitchen table. She sat across from him, and she told him all of it. From the moment Howard slid the sealed envelope across the conference table, to the drive out to Route 9, to Raymond's boots by the door, to sitting on the hallway floor and crying to opening the letter, the key, the study, the panel in the east wall, the safe. She told him the number. Garrett sat very still throughout. He was good at stillness when he wanted to be a thing he had gotten from Raymond, that capacity for a controlled quiet that looked like patience. He did not interrupt. He held his coffee cup in both hands and listened to the whole thing before he said a word. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. A bus went by outside. Someone's car alarm cycled once and stopped. "He planned it," Garrett said. "Not a question. For 14 months, while he was dying. Yes." He set his cup down with a small, careful motion. "He knew I'd fail. He set it up so I'd lose." He stopped. "He set it up so you'd lose the things that were making you into someone he didn't recognize," Frances said. "That's different from designing it so you'd fail. He wasn't interested in your failure, Garrett. He was interested in what came after it." His jaw worked. Something moved through his face, not one thing, but a sequence like weather systems passing. Anger first, then grief, then something she did not have a word for. Something that was possibly the specific feeling of understanding for the first time the full dimensions of how much someone had loved him. "He could have just talked to me," he said. "He tried," she said quietly. "For years. Small conversations you ended. Dinners where you talked over him. Phone calls you returned 3 days late. I watched him try. You weren't available. That's not blame. That's just true." He did not argue. He looked at the table and she could see him going back through something in his memory, sifting the way you sift when someone says a thing you did not want to be true. And you check it against what you remember and find with a sinking feeling that they are right. "Are you angry at him?" Garrett asked. "For keeping all of this from you, for dying with this plan in his pocket while you sat beside him not knowing?" She had thought about that a lot. "Yes," she said. "I'm angry about that. Not in a way that changes anything, but yes. I wish he'd trusted me with it while he was still here." A pause. "But I also know why he didn't. He didn't tell me because I would have tried to protect you from it. And he was right. I would have. Even after what you said to me, I would have found a way to make it smaller. Because that's what I've done your whole life." She looked at her son. Raymond knew that. So he made it impossible. And then he died, and the choice of what to do next stopped being his and became mine. Garrett stared at her, his eyes red again. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said, for years of it." The words were simple. He did not dress them up or surround them with explanation. He just put them on the table between them, plain and unprotected, the way an apology only counts when it is put out there, with nothing defending it. She nodded. "I know. I believe you." A pause. It took everything that happened to get here. But yes, I believe you. He exhaled. Something in his shoulders dropped. I'm going to offer you something, she said. And I need you to listen to every part of it before you react. Because there are conditions, and the conditions are not negotiable. He straightened slightly. The old businessman reflex attention sharpening at the word offer. But it was different now, less calculating, more like a man who has been drowning and heard the word rope. Okay, $50,000, a loan, not a gift, with a repayment schedule that Howard will draw up and that you will sign, and that will be legally binding. She watched his face. Enough to start something small, something real. Not Bowen Industries. Not anything with that name or that history. Something new that you build yourself from the ground up. He said nothing. The conditions. You work for it. Honest work, whatever you're actually good at, whatever has real value. You live within your means, which are currently modest. You repay your debts to the investors, to whoever is owed on whatever schedule is legally possible. And she paused. Let this part land separately. You go see someone, a therapist, a professional. You go and you keep going, not until you feel better, until you understand why you became who you became. That's not optional. His jaw tightened at that last part. She had expected it. Not optional, she said again evenly. He looked at the table back at her. She watched him fight with it visibly, which was the most honest thing she had seen from him in years. Okay, he said. All of it. She studied him. She was not naive. She was 64 years old. She had lived with a complicated man and raised a more complicated son, and she was under no illusion that okay meant this would be easy or clean. People do not change the way stories describe changing in clear movements. Each lesson fully learned before the next begins. Real change is ugly and uneven and full of reversals. But she knew what she had seen in his face, and she trusted that more than she trusted her fear. One more thing, she said. Your father's grave. I want you to go. Not once. Regularly. Not because it's what I want, though it is. Because I think you have things to say to him that you haven't said. And the saying of them matters even if he can't hear you. Maybe especially because he can't hear you. Garrett looked down at his hands. What if I don't know what to say? You'll figure it out, she said. You're his son. You have more of him in you than you know. He signed the loan documents 2 weeks later in Howard Quinn's office, at the same mahogany table where the will had been read. He signed every page with a steadiness she recognized as effort, something he was choosing rather than something that came naturally. His signature on the last page looked slightly looser than the first, like something had given way by the end. Congratulations, Howard said with genuine warmth, collecting the pages. Starting over is harder than starting. Most people don't do it. Garrett looked up at him. You think this will work? Howard considered the question seriously, which Francis appreciated. I think you have the ability to make it work. Whether it does depends entirely on choices you haven't made yet. They walked out of the building together and stood on the sidewalk in the cold. The same sidewalk where a photographer had once caught Garrett looking like a man watching his life come apart. He looked different now. Not better exactly. Not put together. But present here in his body on this sidewalk, in this version of his life, not performing one that no longer existed. "I'm going to the cemetery this weekend," he said. "I still don't know what I'm going to say." "You have until the weekend," Francis said. "You'll think of something." He nodded, turned up his collar, started to move. "Garrett." He stopped. "Your father used to say the oak tree in the farmhouse yard was older than everyone's problems combined. I don't know if that's true, but I think about it when things feel very large. It helps sometimes." Something passed through his face, quiet and real and not performed. "I remember that tree," he said. "I know you do." He walked away down the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, heading toward whatever came next. She watched him go until he turned the corner. Then she stood there alone in the cold on an ordinary city street, with the sound of traffic and the smell of winter air, and Raymond's voice somewhere in the back of her mind, patient and quiet as it always was. "Trust me." She had trusted him, but she had also finally trusted herself. She turned and walked the other direction toward her car, toward the rest of the afternoon, toward the slow and imperfect business of a life being rebuilt from the right materials this time. The winter that followed was the longest Francis could remember, not because it was particularly cold or dark, though it was both. It was long the way winters are long when you are paying attention to them for the first time in a while. When you are not simply enduring the season while waiting for something else to happen, but actually living inside it, day by day, noticing the light change by small degrees, noticing the way the city sounds different when snow is on the ground, noticing yourself. She had not noticed herself in a long time. That sounds like a small thing. It was not. There is a specific kind of disappearance that happens to women who spend decades organizing their lives around other people's needs. It does not announce itself. It is just a slow erosion, one small accommodation at a time, until you look up one day and cannot remember the last time you made a decision that had nothing to do with anyone else. Francis had been disappearing for years quietly, without even fully knowing it was happening. That winter, she started coming back. She renovated the farmhouse, not all at once. It was a process with contractors who showed up late and materials that came in wrong, and a heating system that took 3 visits before anyone identified the actual problem. She made decisions about every room, floors, walls, windows, the kitchen that had flooded every spring for 20 years, because nobody had ever fixed the drainage. She fixed the drainage. She chose paint colors she liked, not colors that were safe or neutral, or likely to please guests. She put Raymond's boots in the bedroom on a shelf because she wanted to see them every morning, not as a shrine, just because they were his and she loved him, and there was no rule that said she had to put that somewhere private. Sylvia came to visit in February, her first trip since before the funeral, her hip finally cooperating enough for the flight. She stood in the renovated kitchen with a cup of tea and looked around at what the house had become. Raymond would have loved this. "I know. You look different," Sylvia said. She tilted her head, studying Francis the way she had studied her their whole lives, with that older sister attention that misses nothing. "Like you're standing in the right place." Francis thought about that a long time after. Sylvia was right. That was exactly what it felt like. Not happiness, necessarily. Happiness was too simple a word for something this complicated, this weighted with grief and change. But rightness. A quality of being where she was supposed to be, doing what she was supposed to be doing in a way she had not felt in more years than she could count. Raymond had given her the room to stand in the right place, but she was the one standing in it. That part was hers. Garrett called every Sunday. It started about 6 weeks after the loan signing without either of them planning it. He called one Sunday afternoon, they talked for 40 minutes, and the next Sunday he called again. And after 4 or 5 Sundays, it had simply become the structure of things. He had started a consulting practice, small just himself at first, working from a rented desk in a shared office space, which he described the first time he mentioned it with a deliberate flatness, like he was daring himself to say the words without embarrassment. "How is it?" she asked. "Weird," he said. "Good weird. I keep waiting for someone to figure out that I used to run a company worth 40 times what this client is paying me and treat me differently. And nobody does because nobody here knows." A pause. "It's actually kind of a relief not being known." "Yes," she said. "I imagine it is." He went to therapy. He did not talk about it much, and she did not push. That had been her instinct for weeks, to ask to monitor the way she had monitored everything involving Garrett for 40 years, and she had been deliberate about resisting it. What he said in one of the early calls was this: "She asks hard questions. I go in thinking I'll talk about business stress for 45 minutes, and somehow she ends up asking me about when I was 12, and I come out feeling like I've been turned inside out. I think it's probably working." "Probably," she agreed, careful to keep the relief out of her voice. He went to Raymond's grave. The first time he told her about it briefly in the middle of a sentence about something else, like he was trying to slip it past both of them. The second time he told her what he had said. "I told him I was sorry for not being there more at the end. And I told him I understood finally why he did what he did. Not completely. I don't think I'll completely understand it for a long time. But enough." A pause on the line. "And then I just talked about what I was working on. About the consulting. It felt stupid." "It doesn't sound stupid." I told him about the shared desk, and there was something in his voice that was almost humor-wry and self-aware and new. I figured he'd appreciate the humility of it. She smiled at her kitchen wall. He would have laughed, and then he would have told you he was proud of you. A long silence. "Yeah, I think so too." He met Marlo in March. Francis heard about her gradually, the way you hear about important things from people who are not ready to announce them. In sideways mentions. A name dropped and not followed up on. There was a coffee shop near his office, he said, and the owner knew him now, and there was usually a woman there who graded papers. A teacher. 4th grade, 9 years. She had grown up in a small town and did not know anything about corporate finance and did not care. "She asked me what I actually liked about my work," he said one Sunday. "Not what I was good at, what I liked." And I couldn't answer right away, and she just waited. She wasn't impatient. She just waited until I had something real to say. "And did you?" Francis asked. "Have something real to say?" Eventually, it took a minute. Francis thought about Sloane, about the careful architecture of that marriage, about how much of it had been two people performing success at each other. And she thought about what it meant that Garrett was sitting across a table from a woman who was not impressed by what he had been and was simply waiting for him to say something true. "She sounds like good people," she said. She is," Garrett said. And the simplicity of it, the absence of strategy or performance in those two words, was the most hopeful thing she had heard from him in years. Sloane, she should say, landed on her feet. She called in April, her voice lighter than Francis had ever heard it. "I took a job in a different city. Marketing director for a nonprofit. It pays a third of what I made before." A pause. "I'm excited about it." "Good," Francis said and meant it. "Francis, I've thought a lot about what you said in your kitchen, about figuring out what my life looks like. Not Garrett's. Mine." A breath. "I just wanted to say thank you for not treating me like the enemy. I know that would have been easier." "You weren't the enemy," Francis said. "You were someone who made the same mistake a lot of people make, choosing who to be based on who you're with instead of who you actually are. That's not an enemy. That's just human." Sloane laughed, small and real. "Yeah, that's pretty much it." They said goodbye, and Francis did not expect to hear from her again. And that was all right. Some people pass through your life at the exact moment they need to and then move on. And the moving on is not a failure of connection. It is just the right shape of things. In May, Francis established the first of what would become 3 charitable initiatives funded through Raymond's estate. She established them herself, with Howard handling the legal mechanics and nothing more. The first was a scholarship fund at the community college across town, full tuition for students returning to education after the age of 40, specifically because she understood something about the courage that required, and because she had opinions about who deserved a second chance and wanted to do something concrete about them. The second was a partnership with a hospital to fund support services for the families of dying patients, for the people sitting in hospital rooms holding hands who needed someone to talk to and often had no one, who were disappearing quietly in the rooms of the dying and would emerge months later hollow and lost with no map for what came after. She knew something about that particular disappearance. The third came later after a conversation that surprised her. Garrett called one Sunday and said, unprompted, "I've been thinking about what you did with the loan, about the structure of it. There are people who can't start over because there's no one in their corner who'll take the risk on them. Not a bank, not a family member. Nobody." A pause. "What would it look like to do that at Scale A Fund? For people trying to rebuild legitimate businesses after a collapse?" She sat with that a moment. "Are you suggesting we build something together?" "I'm suggesting it might be worth thinking about. You have the resources. I'm starting to have the experience of what the bottom actually looks like. That combination might be useful to people." It was the first time Garrett had proposed a collaboration instead of an assumption of control. The first time he had framed his own knowledge as something that might serve others rather than elevate himself. She noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice a small plant coming up through concrete with a disproportionate amount of feeling because you know what it costs to get there. "Let's think about it," she said. The wedding was in September. Garrett and Marlowe had been together 8 months, which is not long by most measures, but Frances had stopped measuring Garrett's life by most measures. She had started measuring it by the quality of what was in it. When he called on a Tuesday evening in July to say he had asked Marlowe to marry him, his voice held something she had not heard since he was young. Not excitement, solidity. A solidity that came not from certainty about the future, but from certainty about the person beside him and the kind of man he was trying to be. She said yes, he said, slightly stunned. Mom, I'm 40 years old and I'm broke and I share an office desk with a 28-year-old who's better at spreadsheets than I'll ever be. And she said yes. Of course she said yes, Frances said. Because of who you are, not what you have. Do you understand what that means? A silence. Yeah, he said quietly. For the first time in my life, I actually do. The wedding was held at the farmhouse. Garrett had asked tentatively whether that would be all right, and Frances had said yes before he finished the sentence. The garden she had spent the spring restoring was in full late summer form by September. Not perfect. Gardens never are. There were still bare patches where the soil had not recovered, but green and real and alive in the way things are when they have been tended by someone who cares about them rather than someone performing the caring. They set up chairs under the oak tree. Raymond's oak tree, older than everyone's problems, combined its leaves, just beginning to think about turning at the edges that early September gold that promises autumn without quite committing. Marlowe wore a simple, cream-colored dress she had bought with her own money and altered herself because she was handy with a needle the way practical people often are. She looked beautiful in the way that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with being genuinely unself-consciously happy in a moment. Garrett stood under the oak in a suit that was not expensive. He had one good suit left from his previous life, and he had declined Frances's offer to buy him a new one, which she had respected. He watched Marlowe walk toward him across the garden with an expression she had not seen on his face in decades. He looked like someone who knew he did not deserve this and was going to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it anyway. That she has learned is the closest any of us gets to deserving anything good. Sylvia stood beside her, having flown in from Portland despite her hip, which she declared worth it. She gripped Frances's arm during the vows, and Frances gripped hers back, and neither of them said anything, which was the right call. Howard Quinn was there too in the third row, and when Frances caught his eye, he nodded at her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has kept a very important secret for a very long time and is finally watching it fulfill its purpose. After the ceremony, when the small gathering had moved toward the tables and music was playing from a speaker with a thoughtfully made playlist, Garrett came to find her. He handed her a glass of something sparkling, and they stood together at the edge of the garden under the oak's shadow. Near the ceremony space on a small table was Raymond's photograph, framed, which Frances had placed there without asking permission because she had not needed permission. This was her house. This was her decision. And Raymond belonged here as much as any of them. Garrett was quiet a long moment, looking at the photograph. Then he knelt down right there in the grass, in his one good suit, in front of his father's photograph. Not performing it for anyone, most of the guests were not watching, just a man kneeling speaking quietly to a father who was not there to hear it. Frances could not make out the words. She was not trying to. Some conversations are not ours to witness, even when we are standing close enough to touch them. He was down there maybe a minute. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and turned back to her. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. He just let them be wet, which for Garrett was the bravest thing she had watched him do. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting his plan." "Thank you," she said, "for being worth trusting it for." "But Garrett," she held his gaze, "I want you to understand one thing about today. Your father set the beginning of this in motion. But everything after he died, the loan, the conditions, the choice to let you fall, the choice to catch you, all of that was mine. I made those decisions, not him." She smiled just slightly. "I'd like you to remember that your mother did that." He looked at her and something settled in his face. Not resolution exactly, more like the solid click of a thing finally sitting correctly in its place. "I'll remember," he said, and then quieter with something that was almost a smile. "He was right about a lot of things, but you're the one who's been here." "He usually was right," she said. "It was very annoying." Garrett laughed. The real one. The one she had not heard in 15 years. Unguarded and sudden and completely his. The one from when he was 7 years old in the branches of that exact tree. There it was. There it was. 8 months after the wedding, Garrett came to the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon. He brought Marlo, who was by then visibly pregnant, a girl due in spring. He also brought something Frances was not expecting, a check in a manila envelope. He sat at the kitchen table, Raymond's kitchen table, the same table where she had read the letter. The night everything changed and he put both in front of her. The check was the loan repayment. All $50,000 plus the interest they had agreed on, paid 18 months ahead of schedule. "I want to pay it back properly," he said. "I know you didn't need the money. That's not the point. The point is I borrowed it and I said I'd repay it, and I'm repaying it." She folded the check once and set it aside. "What's in the envelope?" He glanced at Marlo. Something passed between them, the private communication of two people who have learned each other's language. "It's a proposal for the Second Chance Fund. I've spent 4 months putting it together. Legal structure, funding model, intake criteria, oversight." He pushed it toward her. "I didn't want to just talk about it. I wanted to show up with something real." She opened it. 47 pages, carefully organized, thorough in a way that spoke to months of serious thought. She did not read it all then. She read enough to see that her son had taken the experience of his own destruction and turned it into something that might prevent someone else's, or at least make the rebuilding less impossible. "You know," she said, setting the pages down, "that when we do this, it has to be done right, with accountability, with oversight. You can't run it like a passion project. I know that. And there will be people it doesn't work for. People who take the money and don't change. You have to be prepared for that. I know that too." He paused. "It happened to me in a way. The first time I got a second chance in my 20s when Dad bailed me out of an investment that went wrong, I learned nothing. I just walked away thinking I'd gotten lucky." He looked at the table. "The difference this time was that I had no cushion, no one to call. I had to sit in the actual consequence until it changed me. Not everyone needs that exact thing, But nobody changes without hitting something real first. She looked at her son, 41 years old, sitting at his father's kitchen table next to a woman who loved him for the right reasons, with a daughter coming with a proposal in 47 pages, and a repaid debt, and the specific quiet dignity of a man who had learned the hardest lesson available and survived it. He was not perfect. He would never be perfect. He still had a temper he managed imperfectly. He still had moments of arrogance that surfaced in the wrong context that Marlowe, she gathered, had no patience for and said so. But he was here present, trying building something from the ground up for the second time in his life. And this time from the right materials. "Okay," she said, "let's build it." They named the fund the Bowen Initiative, which was Garrett's idea, and which she agreed to after a long conversation about whether it was right to name something after a family that had spent a year being publicly dismantled. Garrett argued that the name was not about legacy or reputation. It was about accountability. That if something went wrong, their name was on it, and that mattered. That you put your name on the things you were willing to stand behind. She thought about Raymond and the quiet 14 months he had spent building something with her name on it. She agreed. But she made one thing clear: she would be the founder. Garrett would join after. Because she had built things now, real things, with her own hands and her own judgment. And she was done being the consolation prize in anyone's story, including her own, her. The first year, the Bowen Initiative funded 11 people. Small businesses, fresh starts, people who had lost everything to circumstances ranging from bad luck to bad decisions, and deserved the chance to try again with support, not charity. Structure, mentorship, accountability. The same conditions Francis had given Garrett, scaled and formalized. Not all 11 made it. 2 walked away. 1 returned the money. But 8 by the end of that first year were standing, making payroll, paying it back slowly in the amounts they could manage. 8 people standing who had not been standing before. Raymond would have said that was a start. He would have been right. On a Sunday evening in late October, 2 years after the will reading, Francis sat on the farmhouse porch as the light went down. The garden was preparing for winter again. The second winter she had watched it do this from this porch. Some of the plantings she had put in during spring were showing themselves now in the structure they had built. Underground, the parts you cannot see yet. But that would come back. That is how perennials work. You plant them and they disappear. And you have to trust that what you did was enough. That something is happening beneath the surface even when you cannot see it. Garrett had called that morning from somewhere that sounded like a park. His daughter was 5 weeks old, small enough to be terrifying. And he had gone out while Marlowe slept because the baby liked motion. And he described with the specific wonder of a first-time parent who had not expected to be transformed. The precise shape of his daughter's fist gripping his finger. "She just grabbed it," he said, still slightly stunned. "Like she meant it. Like it was specifically my finger she wanted." "It was," Francis said. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there when you were that size, and yours was specifically my finger too." A silence. Then, quietly, "What did you call me in those early days? Before I became whatever I became?" She thought about it. "Ray," she said, "when it was just us." I called you Ray after your father. You looked like him those first weeks before you grew into my jaw." He was quiet a long moment. "Ray," he said, like he was trying it on, like it was something retrieved from a place he had stopped looking. "Yes," she said. "Ray." They stayed on the phone a while after that, not saying much, just existing in the same call while his daughter slept against his chest in a park somewhere. And now on the porch in October, Francis sat with a cup of tea and watched the sky go from gold to orange to the specific bruised purple of a clear evening before full dark. The kind of sky Raymond used to stop what he was doing to look at. He said a sky like that was the world being honest about something. She thought about everything. About the woman who had walked into that law office in an unwashed black dress, expecting nothing. About the woman who had sat on the floor by a dead man's boots and cried until she was empty and then gotten up and kept going. About the woman who had stood in this garden and refused to be frightened by a man with 3 generations of money. About what it had cost and what it had built and what had been broken, and whether the breaking was worth what grew from it. There is no clean answer to that question. Anyone who tells you there is not telling you the truth. What Raymond did was an act of love that was also unquestionably an act of control. What Frances did by trusting the plan and then making it her own was brave and was also in honest moments a thing she would spend the rest of her life turning over. She is still not entirely at peace with what Garrett lost. The losing was still terrible. Both of those things are true at once, and neither cancels the other. That is what she has learned maybe more than anything, that the true things are almost always the complicated ones. That love is not simple. That family is not simple. That the people who hurt you and the people who save you are sometimes the same people at different points in the same story. That forgiveness is not a feeling but a practice, repeated, imperfect, chosen again every time the old wound announces itself. That money is not nothing but it is very close to the last thing that matters. That real wealth, the kind that does not fit in a safe, the kind that cannot be inherited or stolen or lost in a lawsuit, is built out of the things that are hardest to keep. Honesty, humility, the willingness to be changed by your failures, and love stubborn enough to survive the versions of people they are before they become who they needed to be. Raymond knew that. He always knew it. And at the end, when he had nothing left but time, he set one final lesson in motion. But it was Frances who carried it the rest of the way. It was Frances who decided when to let go and when to hold on, who faced down the men who came for what was hers, who chose the conditions and chose the mercy and chose finally to stop disappearing. The sky went fully dark. The oak tree disappeared into it, its shape visible only against the stars. She finished her tea. She thought, there she is, Frances. There she is. And she went inside into the warm and imperfect and fully her own house, and she closed the door behind her.